You know, it really is interesting when things come full circle like this. Equilibrium was basically Fahrenheit 451 if it were an action movie, and now Fahrenheit 451 is basically Equilibrium if it was really, really boring. Hello my beautiful watchers. By popular demand, I'm including this review of HBO's 2018 adaptation of Ray Bradbury's work as a supplement to the Lost in Adaptation episode I did on the 1966 British version. As you might have guessed from the intro, I really didn't care for it. I mean, I didn't hate it, I just kind of nothinged it, to be completely honest. Trust me, there would be no point in me doing this as a Lost in Adaptation episode, as I'd have to immediately declare it in name only, and to prove that, I'm going to quickly go over the plot now. If you've not read the book, I already included a synopsis of that in the adaptation review, there's the thing. I do have to say before I start though, no matter how I word this, I guarantee you it's going to sound more concise, sensical, and book accurate than it came across in the film, because that shit was a clusterfuck on a level I really don't think I can convey verbally. Okay, let's do this. In the not-too-distant future, America is recovering from a second civil war, an after-effect of which is all physical copies of anything written down being declared contraband, so the government can have complete control over people's education and information intake via the heavily monitored internet, which has been renamed the Nine for some reason. You're still allowed to read books, but they're heavily censored and mostly made up of emoji. Yeah, emoji are villainized in this. This should tell you a lot about what you need to know about this film. Guy Montag, now played by Michael B. Jordan, fresh off his huge success of playing Killmonger in Black Panther, holds the rank of Master Trooper in the relatively new military branch known as the Firemen, a countrywide law enforcement organisation whose job it is to find and destroy illegal writing, referred to as graffiti. Montag is apparently something of a celebrity because of his charismatic showboating during missions that are constantly live-streamed and projected into people's homes and onto the sides of skyscrapers. His best friend and mentor, Captain Beatty, played by Michael Shannon, is training him up to replace him as captain of their unit once he's promoted to major later in the year, and they do things like go to schools to show off their cool flamethrower skills and teach the kids about how evil and dangerous books are. In this version of the story, the punishment for getting caught with books is having your fingerprints burned off and your online identity erased, so you can't function in society anymore and have to live in the slums surrounding the city. Beatty and Montag are apparently so committed to their jobs, even when they're out of uniform they spend their time chasing up leads on people who might be harbouring graffiti and speaking to informants, eels looking to shorten their sentence by betraying other book owners so they can get their sweet, sweet internets back. One such informant is Clarice, a young eel with a 6-year sentence that Montag kind of has the hots for, but is still a dick to. A tip from Clarice leads the firemen to a house occupied by a lone woman and filled with books where Beatty explains to Montag the importance of destroying things that offend people and make them unhappy. Then, in a surprise move, the woman sets fire to her own books and herself, crying out the word omnis before dying. Shaken by this, Montag steals a book and goes to talk to Clarice, who herself is overcome with guilt for helping the firemen. Together they start reading stuff and, I guess, dating. They get very cuddly. Meanwhile, the firemen have been investigating what this omnis thing is and find out it's a method of compressing all of humanity's knowledge into a single particle of a strand of DNA. That seems unrealistically more advanced than the rest of the technology we've seen so far, but okay, I'll roll with it for now. The eels are apparently trying to get the Omnis to Canada, because that's where all the scientists are now, with, the firemen assume, the intention of recreating it and spreading humanity's knowledge around the world again via DNA. The firemen are ordered to crack down hard on all known eels to try to find this tech and contain it before it goes north. Montag continues to work as a fireman while also stealing books, and is just as bad about hiding it as he is in all other versions of the story, and Beatty gets wise to him and has him followed, which proves unnecessary because Clarice and some friends turn up to pick him up in the middle of town surrounded by security cameras. They take him to a group of people outside the city who preserve books by memorizing them, and they insist on giving him an initiation test where he has to murder a captured fireman, which he is totally about to do, but then they stop him at the last second and it turns out this test was just a test and they don't even have a fireman prisoner. They introduce him to a kid who has some sort of social disorder but a perfect memory, who's personally memorized 13,000 books and has a pet starling that they've implanted the Omnis into. It's been trained to fly in the general direction of Canada as soon as they release it, but they need Montag to get them a transponder, technology only firemen have access to, so the Canadian scientists can track it down once it's there. Yeah, apparently these guys have figured out how to shrink all of humanity's knowledge down into a single particle of DNA, but just cannot figure out how to handle a GPS locator. Montag agrees, but as soon as he's back in the fireman headquarters, he's pounced on by Beatty and the others, who drive him to his house to publicly arrest him on a livestream, having planted a bunch of books in his home because the film forgot to establish that he was keeping any there. Montag obliges in burning down his house, then gives back his flamethrower, punches a guy, gets his flamethrower, kills a guy who's not BT, and then runs off. He meets up with Clarice and they start to head to the others to give them the transponder, but the firemen figure out where they're going and get there first, arresting everyone and setting fire to everything. Clarice rushes off to help and Montag sneaks into the building to find all the book memorizers dead, but the bird's still alive because, as you all know, starlings are more resistant to smoke inhalation. He's confronted by an angry armed BT, but still attaches the transponder and lets the bird go, which enrages his former captain so much he burns Montag alive. The film ends with the bird making it to Canada and joining a bunch of other birds for a bird party, so at least we got a happy ending for the bird, I guess. Okay, the first thing I want to bring up is, where are my motherfucking mechanical hounds, you wankers? These guys had the tech and the budget to make those things happen, but they chose not to, instead giving the firemen a drone to zip around doing bugger all. After a certain point in this film, when I decided it was in-name only, I stopped keeping track of all the book inaccuracies, but even then there were some things that I just had to write down because they were figuratively the exact opposite of what went down in the book. The biggest one being BT torching Montag instead of vice versa, but there was also stuff like Clarice being a hardened criminal, playing for both sides because she works with the book people but also as an informant for the firemen and giving them real tips that led to people getting hurt. The entire point of her character in the book was she was this innocent little free-spirited cinnamon roll who was too pure for this world and eventually got consumed by it. I mean, even the first film stuck to this because even though she was manipulating Montag at first, she comes clean about it because she just can't handle lying to someone. You probably noticed there was no nuke ending in this version either, and there was even less talk about war than in the British version. BT said something about the dark countries and how they would take over if they managed to get the info out of the Omnus. I'm not sure if this was supposed to mean that all countries in the world except America had become third world, or if this was just a derogatory term for nations that hadn't chosen to strictly control their literature. If it's the latter, I'm really not sure why they would need America's Forbidden History books, and if it's the former, I just don't know what good it would do them, even if they could somehow get the experimental technology required to extract the info out of the animal's DNA. This shit makes no sense! Okay, before I go any further, I should probably address something that I intentionally left out of the Lost in Adaptation episode, namely that claiming in the original novelette the government banned books to make people dumber is not entirely true, or at least slightly misleading, because according to BT and Faber, the population actually did it to themselves and the government just took advantage of it. It was actually a combination of minority groups getting offended by famous works from the past, leading to them getting banned due to political correctness, and a decreasing attention span that called for shorter and shorter books until the only ones that could get sold were like one-page magazines. Now, the reason I avoided bringing this up in the original episode is because Bradley, according to his own words in interviews, apparently genuinely believed that pesky minorities and social justice warriors would be the death of America as we know it, and not only that, but before he died, he declared that the dystopian future where everyone's a willing dumbass that he was trying to warn everyone about had actually come to pass with the dawn of the internet. Even though Erica was playing me in that episode, I didn't want to run the risk of letting her bear the brunt of a potential flame war that talking about that stuff might start, so I held off on it then, but I thought I should bring it up now because it looks like the makers of this film wanted to modernise the story and take into account the technological advances that took place since the book was written, and either they shared the focus of Bradley's new dislike or actively based the film on it. Yep, it turns out when I wrote this in my other review,
Bradbury's obvious disgust towards the effects of watching too much TV, something that was clearly shared by other authors of the time like Roald Dahl, kind of reminds me of the current hostility towards extensive smartphone use and social media addiction.
Apparently I was being clairvoyant about this film, which I swear I hadn't watched yet. That's right, the internet is the new villain here, because it's not something physical, not something real, it can be altered and controlled, and it's got silly things on it that make people dumber. As a result, this movie sports dystopian future emoji, dystopian future Alexa, dystopian future Periscope, and dystopian future Super Chat. However, for a film that seems intent on villainizing the internet, it didn't seem to understand it all that well. I looked up the writer to see if he was like a really old man, but no, he's only 43, which I don't think is old enough to serve as an excuse here. For example, when the firemen want to censor the internet, they go to people's houses and burn all their computers and modems and stuff. Come on guys, if you're going to switch the focus from the physical to cyberspace, then like 90% of a fireman's job would be done in an office in front of a computer trying to track down all of the torrenting sites and the like. I mean, if they had at least acknowledged that that was part of it, it, like cut to a room full of technicians trying to handle that side of things, I might have been more forgiving, but apparently no, the only way to stop the internet is to flamethrower people's routers and keyboards, because that's how them pesky computer things work, right? If I smash the keyboard, I delete the Facebook. Well, as I so prominently stated my belief that this movie is more of a rip-off of Equilibrium than an adaptation of Fahrenheit, I guess I should probably back that up with some proof at some point, shouldn't I? For starters, in the opening credits sequence, they appear to be burning art as well as written work. Now, I'm sure there's some lessons to be learned from paintings and the like, but I'm pretty sure art's primary purpose is to elicit an emotional reaction, not to educate people. You could make the case that this film's focus is not so much on books anymore, or making people dumber, but about the government wanting to control everything, regardless of whether or not it might actually pose a threat to them, but I'm more inclined to believe they wanted to recreate the powerful imagery of a priceless piece of art being so callously destroyed that works so well in Equilibrium. The population as a whole did have a serious problem with addiction to medication in the book, but like the dumbing down of all things written, that's something they very much did to themselves. In this version of the film, drugs are mandatory and government issue. Michael B. Montag is enthusiastically all in on the fireman's cause at the start, which admittedly they did do in the other film as well, but I still think it came out a little bit too much like Christian Bale's character. Not once does a fireman ever have to fight anyone in the novel. They are there to burn books. If anyone tries to get violent or run away, the mechanical hound would deal with them. But of course, Michael B. Montag has to martial arts a violent eel every now and again. Well, okay, just once in this film, any more and it might have been more interesting, but it's implied it's a regular part of the job. It all seems really odd to me. I mean, Equilibrium was okay, I liked it, but I can't claim it was groundbreaking. It was a fun action flick, but probably not worth ripping off. So I noticed in that credit sequence that they were also burning stuff that looked distinctly foreign. The Girl with the Pearl Earring painting, for example, which is on display in the Netherlands, unless I'm mistaken, which means either America stole other people's art and burned that too, or the rest of the world followed suit in destroying their culture. There were some little sci-fi touches I liked in this, like Montag mentioned he was going to get the dentist to 3D print him a new tooth to replace the one that Beatty knocked out in a boxing match. The firemen are a lot more militarized in this version. In the book and in the first film, it looked a lot like they were just the actual fire service, except they burn shit now. In the film, they're all about singing army songs and chants, and there's this whole chain of command and a complex ranking system now. One thing that had me in absolute stitches during this was the fact that Montag is apparently still saving things from destruction and hiding them in his air duct, but it's not books this time, it's things like VHS or mini DV tapes, and he doesn't have a VCR, so it just looks ridiculous, him staring at this blockbuster video cassette like it's an item of absolute wonder. It's also funny to me that while the first film made the TVs too small to match the book, this film went in the opposite direction and made them way, way bigger than Bradbury ever conceived. I mentioned in the Lost in Adaptation review that Bradbury came up with an early sort of proto-idea of what virtual reality was going to be like, with the room where all four walls are made of TV screens. Because TVs were so bulky and so heavy back then, it didn't occur to most sci-fi writers that maybe VR would involve one little screen right in front of your eyes instead of lots of big ones surrounding you. Anyway, my point is, I kind of expected them to expand on this in the film, but no, there was just one scene that takes place in some sort of VR cafe, but they don't really use it in the plot at all. Possibly because Ready Player One was just coming out around the same time and they didn't want to risk association, I don't know. By the way, this is like a really chill VR cafe. Clearly none of those guys are playing super hot. I assumed very briefly that the old man they caught making inflammatory videos in the back of the tailor shop might have been Faber, but then they did nothing else with the character and I couldn't find a Faber in the credits, so I guess not. Beatty is given a lot of screen time in this, possibly because they didn't want to waste having Michael Shannon, and they really pushed the idea that he's super conflicted about what he does because it turns out he owns an illegal pen and he writes down random quotes that he can remember from books on cigarette paper and then burns them when he's done. But then after these writing sessions, he comes down harder and harder on Montag about why what they do is important and necessary, as if he's trying to compensate for his weakness. I thought this was a really clever way of bringing back the subconscious suicide angle of his character, but that obviously evaporated when they pulled the switcheroo of who killed who at the end. They added in an additional backstory for Montag that involved him believing his father was a dedicated fireman who was killed by eels resisting arrest, but slowly remembering throughout the film that he was actually a book owner who was murdered by firemen. This doesn't really contribute to much plot-wise, aside from giving Montag extra motivation to do what he was already doing. The film really handled Montag's change of heart badly, in my opinion. It's like, okay, so he's really into his mission at the start, but no, apparently he's already stealing shit, so I guess he was faking that? And then Beatty gives him the speech intended to be a warning, but it comes before Beatty has any reason to suspect that Montag is off the straight and narrow, so you don't know why he's bothering, and it also kind of looks like Beatty is now the one who tempted him into sin in the first place. The film ended up showing Beatty's confliction way more effectively than Montag's. Judging by the way it's portrayed in this film, being on fire is more of a mild inconvenience than anything else. I'm just saying I might have been a bit more upset by it than these guys seem to be. The thought occurs that it's become a recurring theme now that if you have a movie where Michael B. Jordan is on fire at some point, it's going to bomb. There's a scene where Clarice is trying to teach Montag the harmonica, and I think it was supposed to be touching, but it was just as annoying as you would expect listening to someone try to learn the harmonica would be. I can only assume that Montag and Beatty are permanently on the night shift because 95% of this movie takes place at night, and really weirdly, the only scene that takes place during the day is intentionally overexposed in a really obvious way, and I just couldn't figure out why anyone would ever want to do that in a professional film. It's not hard to see how all of the resistance ended up getting arrested or killed at the end, because everything they do is really stupid. For one thing, they just cannot seem to stick to a plan. At the start, they're trying to upload books to the dark web, but they're also memorizing the books like they did in the novelette, but unlike in the novelette, they don't burn them afterwards, they just keep them lying around to be used as potential evidence against them, and why bother with any of that if the end game is to get all of humanity's knowledge to Canada inside a bird? The book people in the original story, and in the 1966 version, understood that their only chance for survival was not to do anything that would make them worth the government's time to crack down on them and be super subtle about everything they do, or they would get immediately arrested. Exactly like what happens at the end of this film. Montag's role in the plan seems really dumb too. They need a homing beacon to attach to the Starling so the Canadians can find it when it flies there, because it's only trained to fly north, not to a specific place, and remember that Montag leads the firemen to them at the end, so basically they all die or end up in prison because they chose a Starling instead of a homing pigeon as their delivery method. To all the potentially enraged bird watchers out there, if that's not a Starling, I apologise, I just couldn't be asked double checking. Also, thanks so much for spending so long introducing that young man with all the thousands of books in his head only to kill him off in his next appearance. That didn't render his character completely pointless or that scene a massive waste of time or anything. The Resistance is also constantly fucking itself over. Clarice routinely sells them out in exchange for a reduced sentence, which apparently they either never find out about or have no issues with, and the Burning Lady had absolutely no reason to yell out ominous and tip the firemen off that they had a master plan. I mean, yeah, I know she was on fire, but surely, I'm on fire! This was a terrible decision! Would have been a much better thing to yell than giving out the codename of your salvation to the enemy. Also, if their plan was to send Montag back to the firemen to get the transponder they needed, maybe they should have put a little bit more effort into not getting seen grabbing him, you know, so he doesn't get immediately arrested as soon as he gets back. Just a thought. I also have to say they kind of lost the moral high ground with me pretty fucking fast. I mean, the worst a fireman will do to you is burn your stuff and erase your identity so you can't live in the city anymore, which most of the eels weren't doing anyway, but they expected him to kill a tied-up man for them. I mean, yes, it was a fake out, but they wanted to know that he would do it, that he would drive a knife into a helpless prisoner. No Mrs. Montag in the story, but Lord help me, it's so different anyway. The role she originally played, representing the average ignorant member of society, was a tad redundant anyway, so whatever. That might have been because in this version there's a lot more chemistry between Montag and Clarice, who fortunately is upped in age again, so he's not macking on a teenager. Now, to the film's credit, there was one thing that impressed me adaptation-wise, and that was that they worked in callbacks to the titles of the 3 sections that the book is split up into. The Hearth and the Salamander, the Sieve and the Sand, and Burning Bright. That was a nice touch. The Fabian-esque character, the jealous fireman underling, now called Douglas, is slightly less pointless because he does do some stuff like tailing Montag, and he's the poor soul who dies at the point of the story where Montag is supposed to kill Beatty. Random trivia, apparently Michael B. Jordan initially didn't want to star in this film because he didn't like the idea of playing the role of a repressor of minorities, which leads me to suspect he hadn't read the book, but eventually he did accept, partly because he finally wanted to star in the film where he didn't die at the end. which leads me to believe he didn't read the script. So, elephant in the room, from what I can see, this film is clearly more of a dark parody of Trump's America than it is an adaptation of Ray Bradbury's novel. The government tries to regulate what people believe by declaring anything that doesn't agree with them is dangerous fake news, while themselves spreading outright falsehoods about their actions and America's history. There's blatant commentary on the increase in police brutality, and a huge feature of the film is the villainization of a particular marginalized group who are being scapegoated for society's problems. Montag even yells about how the eels are taking hard-working Americans' jobs at the start, which doesn't even make any sense. They're not immigrants, they've always been here working their jobs. Don't get me wrong, it's a bold statement and a relevant message right now, but it's a tad ham-fisted, and it kind of leaves me wishing they just hadn't used Fahrenheit's title so I could take it more seriously as a standalone piece of work. So yeah, this film is basically Equilibrium without the gun kata that made Equilibrium halfway interesting, and it prioritizes being topical over being anything else, to the point where I suspect it's going to become very dated very quickly. The film is so different to the book. On the few occasions where it swings back to an original event or plot twist, it seems really weird and out of place, like it's ingressing on another story instead of calling back to the book it's supposedly based on. If that makes any sense. Sorry, it's been a long review. Everyone's acting in this was absolutely brilliant, but good acting can't make a good movie on its own, and everything else about this was just rambly and incoherent, and I can't say for sure what this film was trying to be, but it certainly wasn't Fahrenheit 451. And on top of all of that, it was, well, boring. At the end of the day, that's my main takeaway from this film. It was boring, and if a film is boring, it really doesn't matter if it was a good or bad adaptation, if it's relevant, if it has a political statement, or who stars in it, because in a few months, no one's going to remember it. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. If you like this review, there's a convenient button you can click to prove it, which has the added bonus of helping my videos defend themselves from the fiendish horrors of the YouTube algorithm, so win-win. If you'd like to talk to me about this or any other adaptation, assuming no one has tried to save you from unhappiness by melting your keyboard, you can comment below or contact me on the Twitter or the Facebook. Links in the video description. The Dom out. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, "My goodness, the Dom, I can't do that. The Llama King will not allow it. The Llama King sees all.
The Llama King cannot be opposed. The Llama King is everything."
Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.